Welcome to London Gritty Chronicles. We begin in the silence. Imagine the year is 1349. You are standing in a field in Essex. It is quiet. Terrifyingly quiet. The church bells have stopped ringing because there is no one left to pull the ropes. The village mill is still because the miller is dead. The wheat is rotting in the earth because the hands that should harvest it are cold and buried in mass graves. This is the Black Death. It was a biological apocalypse that wiped out nearly half of England's population. Now, fast forward 30 years. The year is 1381. The silence is gone. Instead, the air is filled with a new sound. It is not the sound of mourning. It is the sound of shouting. It is the roar of thousands of men and women marching on the roads that lead to London. They are armed with rusty axes, longbows, and sticks burned to a sharp point. They are not fleeing a disease. They are hunting a government. This is the story of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But it is not just a story about angry farmers. It is a story about the bargaining power of labor. For English learners, this is a crucial concept. Bargaining power means the ability to negotiate for a better deal. When you have high bargaining power, you can demand more money. When you have low bargaining power, you must accept what you are given. Tonight, we explore how a biological disaster created a sudden economic miracle for the poor. And how the rich tried to break it. We will see how a simple demand for respect turned into the bloodiest summer in English history. Let us go back to the aftermath of the plague. When the Black Death finally faded, England was a broken landscape. But for the survivors, something strange happened. To understand this, we must look at the math of survival. Before the plague, England was crowded. There were too many workers and not enough land. This meant labor was cheap. If a peasant demanded higher wages, the lord of the manor could simply say, "No, go away. There are 10 other men waiting to take your place." But after the plague, the math reversed. Suddenly, there were empty fields everywhere. The lords needed workers desperately to harvest their crops before they spoiled. But there were no workers. The demographic shock, the sudden drop in population, changed the balance of power. Demographic. This is a useful adjective. It relates to the structure of a population, such as its size, age, or density. The plague was a massive demographic shift. Now, picture a peasant named John. Before the plague, he was a serf, tied to the land, working for almost nothing. Now, a neighboring lord offers him double the wages and free food to come work for him. John realizes something powerful. He is valuable. This period, from 1350 to 1380, is sometimes called the Golden Age of the Laborer. Wages rose. People ate better meat. They wore better clothes. The strict hierarchy of the Middle Ages began to blur. But the ruling class did not like this. They did not view this as economics. They viewed it as a moral collapse. They believed God had arranged the world in 3 orders. Those who fight, the knights. Those who pray, the clergy. And those who work, the peasants. When those who work started demanding knight money, the elites panicked. So they used the law as a weapon. In 1351, the government passed the Statute of Laborers. Listen to that word, statute. A statute is a written law passed by a legislative body. This statute was an attempt to freeze time. It made it illegal to pay a worker more than they earned before the plague. It made it a crime to refuse work. It tried to force the economy back to the way it was in 1347. Imagine the government telling you today that you must work for the same salary your grandfather earned 30 years ago, even though prices have doubled. You would be furious. The English peasants were furious too. They ignored the law. The lords paid them under the table in secret because they needed the work done. A culture of resistance began to grow. For 30 years, the tension built. It was like a pot of water sitting on a fire. The water was simmering. It was hot, but it was not boiling over. It needed a spark. That spark came in the form of a tax. The King of England was Richard II. He was only a boy, just 14 years old. But his advisors, led by his wealthy uncle John of Gaunt, were fighting expensive, losing wars in France. They needed money. They had drained the treasury. So, they introduced the poll tax. In modern English, a poll can mean a survey of opinions. But in 1381, poll meant head. A poll tax is a tax on every head, every person. The problem was the structure of the tax. It was a flat rate. Whether you were a rich merchant with 3 ships or a poor plowman with 1 shirt, you had to pay the same amount. 1 shilling. To a rich man, 1 shilling was pocket change. To a poor man, it was a week's wages. It was the difference between eating and starving. This is what we call regressive taxation. A regressive tax takes a larger percentage of income from low-income earners than from high-income earners. The people of England felt the injustice in their bones. They had paid a poll tax in 1377. They paid another in 1379. But the tax of 1381 was 3 times higher. It was an insult. Across the villages of Essex and Kent, a quiet conspiracy began. When the tax collectors came, the villagers lied. They hid their daughters in the woods. They claimed their elderly parents had died. They cooked the books. To cook the books is a wonderful English idiom. It means to falsify financial records dishonestly. The government in London looked at the tax returns and realized they were short. Thousands of people had vanished from the records. They were furious. They decided to send out tough commissioners to investigate and force the people to pay. This was the mistake that burned London. Come with me now to the village of Brentwood in the county of Essex. The date is May 30th, 1381. It is a small market town. The mood is tense. A royal official named John Bampton arrives with a heavy guard of soldiers. Bampton is a member of Parliament. He is arrogant. He carries a scroll with the names of those who have not paid. He summons the villagers. He demands they stand before him. He opens his ledger and begins to read names. The villagers gather. They are not looking at the ground, as they usually do. They are looking at him. One man steps forward. His name is Thomas Baker. He is a local representative. He looks Bampton in the eye. Baker speaks clearly. He says, essentially, "We have already paid. We have a receipt. We will not pay a penny more." Bampton is shocked. He is used to fear. He is not used to negotiation. He loses his temper. He orders his sergeants to arrest Thomas Baker. This is the tipping point. A tipping point is the critical moment in a situation where a small change leads to a massive, irreversible effect. When the sergeants move to grab Baker, the village explodes. This was not planned. It was a reaction. Men rush forward. They are holding the stones from the road. They are holding old rusty blades. They do not just shout. They attack. Bampton and his men are surrounded. The illusion of authority shatters. Bampton realizes that a piece of parchment with the king's seal cannot stop 100 angry men with rocks. The royal party panics. They scramble onto their horses. They are beaten, bruised, and chased out of Brentwood. They ride for their lives back to London, looking over their shoulders, terrified. But the villagers do not go back to their homes. They know what they have done. Attacking a royal official is treason. The punishment is death. They have crossed a line. There is no going back. Word spreads instantly. It travels from farm to farm faster than a horse. They fought back. Brentwood fought back. By the next morning, the revolt has spread to the next village and the next. It is like a virus. The social pathogen of rebellion is transmitting through the network of labor that the Black Death created. The men of Essex begin to gather in the woods. They are not hiding anymore. They are organizing. They send messengers across the River Thames into the county of Kent. The message is simple. Rise up. The time is now. But who will lead them? A mob needs a head. They need a voice. In a prison cell in Maidstone, a radical priest named John Ball is waiting. He has been preaching dangerous ideas for years. He preaches that there should be no lords and no masters. He preaches that all humans are equal, descended from Adam and Eve. The rebels know he is there, and they are coming to break him out. The government in London thinks this is just a local riot. They think it will burn out in a day. They are wrong. The pot has boiled over, and the scalded water is flowing directly toward the capital. Bad news travels fast, but rebellion travels faster. In the summer of 1381, there was no Twitter, no telephones, and no postal service. Yet within days of the incident at Brentwood, the entire southeast of England was on fire. How did they communicate? They used the river. The River Thames is the main artery of London. It flows out to the sea, separating the county of Essex in the north from the county of Kent in the south. Messengers jumped into small boats. They rowed furiously across the wide grey water. They carried a dangerous message to their neighbors in Kent. We have started. Now it is your turn. And Kent answered. In early June, a new figure emerged from the smoke. His name was Wat Tyler. Historians debate who Wat Tyler really was. Some say he was an unsettled man from Essex. Others claim he was a roofer from Kent. Wat is a short form of Walter. Tyler likely refers to his trade, making tiles for roofs. But one thing is certain. He was a natural leader. He was charismatic. Charismatic describes a person who has a compelling charm that inspires devotion in others. Tyler was not just shouting. He was commanding. He brought discipline to the angry mob. He told them, "We are not thieves. We are soldiers of the true commons." He forbade looting. If a man was caught stealing a silver cup, Tyler had him executed. He wanted to prove that this was a political movement, not a crime spree. Under Tyler's command, the rebels moved toward a specific target: Rochester Castle. This castle was a fortress. It had thick stone walls and was a symbol of royal authority. It was where the government kept runaway serfs and prisoners. Imagine the sight. Thousands of ordinary people, farmers, bakers, butchers, surrounding this massive stone structure. They did not have siege engines. They had sheer numbers and rage. They swarmed the castle. The guards, terrified by the size of the crowd, surrendered. The heavy doors swung open. The prisoners spilled out into the sunlight, blinking and cheering. The rebels had achieved the impossible. They had cracked open the king's jail. This victory gave them momentum. Momentum is a physics term we use in history. It means the impetus, or driving force, gained by a moving object. Once the rebellion had momentum, it was very hard to stop. From Rochester, they marched to Maidstone. Their goal was to find the man we mentioned earlier, the radical priest, John Ball. John Ball was in the Archbishop's prison because he had been preaching heresy. But to the rebels, he was a prophet. They broke down the prison doors and released him. When John Ball stepped out, he did not thank them quietly. He climbed up onto a high place and preached a sermon that shook England. He asked a famous question, a rhyme that is still remembered today. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Let's break this down for a moment. It is beautiful, archaic English. Delved is an old word for dug. It means to dig the earth, like a farmer. Span is the past tense of spin. It refers to spinning wool into thread, traditionally women's work. So, Ball was asking, in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, when Adam was digging the soil and Eve was making clothes, where were the lords? Where were the knights? Where were the masters? The answer, of course, is that they didn't exist. Ball was arguing that social hierarchy, the class system, was man-made, not God-made. He told the crowd that God created everyone equal. He said the time had come to cast off the yoke of bondage. A yoke is a wooden beam used to connect two oxen together to pull a plow. Metaphorically, it means oppression or slavery. The crowd roared. They finally had a voice. They had a general, Wat Tyler, and they had a philosopher, John Ball. They were no longer a scattering of angry villagers. They were an army. They called themselves the True Commons. Now, they had a destination. Tyler and Ball looked west, toward the setting sun, toward the smoke rising on the horizon, toward the seat of power. London. They began the Great March. It was June 10th, 1381. The roads were clogged with people. Estimates suggest there were perhaps 30,000 to 60,000 rebels. To put that in perspective, the entire population of London at that time was only about 40,000. The countryside was emptying. The city was about to be besieged. But what was the king doing? King Richard II was in London. Remember, he was 14 years old. He was staying at the Tower of London, the safest fortress in the city. The mood inside the tower was pure panic. The king's advisors were the ones the rebels hated most. They were the ones who had designed the poll tax. They were the ones who had cooked the books. These advisors, men like Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the treasurer, were trembling. They had heard the reports. They knew the rebels were coming for them specifically. They had a choice. They could send out the professional army to crush the peasants. But here is the accidental twist. The army wasn't there. Most of the English military was overseas. They were in France, fighting the 100 Years' War. They were in Scotland, guarding the northern border. The king was essentially defenseless. He had only a few hundred guards and his personal retinue. The most powerful government in the land was suddenly naked. On June 12th, the rebel army reached Blackheath. Blackheath is a high hill just south of London. From there, you can look down and see the city spread out before you. You can see the spires of the churches and the winding river. The rebels set up camp. At night, their campfires stretched for miles. To the people inside London, it looked like a ring of fire was tightening around their throats. The citizens of London were divided. The rich merchants barred their doors and hid their gold. But the poor workers of London, the apprentices, the servants, the laborers, they looked at the campfires on the hill, and they did not feel fear. They felt hope. They whispered to each other in the dark alleys. They were ready to open the gates. The virus had jumped from the host, the countryside, to the target, the city. Wat Tyler stood on Blackheath and looked down at the capital. He knew the king was trapped in the tower. He sent a message to the king. He did not ask for mercy. He demanded a meeting. He said, "We are the king's true friends. We only want to save him from his wicked advisors." This was a clever political move. It is called framing the narrative. To frame a story means to present it in a specific way to influence how people perceive it. Tyler framed the revolt not as a rebellion against the king, but as a rescue mission for the king. Richard II, the boy king, had to decide. Should he hide behind the stone walls of the tower? Or should he ride out to meet the man who was threatening to burn his city to the ground? The advisors argued, but the fires on the hill were getting brighter. The next morning would decide the fate of England. The bargaining power of labor was about to be tested against the divine right of kings. Rejection turns hope into gasoline. It is the morning of June 13th, 1381. It is the feast of Corpus Christi, a holy day dedicated to the body of Christ. The rebels believe this is a sign. They believe God is marching with them. Wat Tyler has arranged his army on the south bank of the Thames at a place called Rotherhithe. He is waiting for the king. King Richard II, still just a boy, steps onto a royal barge. At the Tower of London. He is surrounded by his nervous advisors. The oars dip into the water. The barge moves slowly downstream toward the rebels. From the river, the king sees thousands of people. They are cheering. They are waving their rusty weapons. To a 14-year-old boy, this does not look like a welcome committee. It looks like a mouth waiting to swallow him. As the barge gets closer, the noise becomes deafening. The rebels are shouting for the heads of the traitors, the king's advisors. On the boat, the Earl of Salisbury, a veteran soldier, grabs the king's arm. He looks at the chaotic crowd on the shore. He says, roughly, "Sire, it is not safe. Do not land. These men are not in their right mind." The barge stops. It hovers on the water just out of reach. The king stands up and shouts across the gap. He asks what they want. The rebels roar back, "We want you! Come to us!" But the oarsmen panic. The advisors order the boat to turn around. The royal barge spins in the current and rows frantically back toward the safety of the tower. The rebels watch the king leave. The cheering stops. A low, angry growl spreads through the crowd. They feel betrayed. They believe the king is being held hostage by his advisors. Wat Tyler turns to his army. He realizes that diplomacy has failed. Tyler shouts a new command. "To London!" There is only one way into the city from the south. London Bridge. In 1381, London Bridge was not just a road over water. It was a narrow stone street lined with shops, houses, and a chapel. It was a choke point. A choke point is a point of congestion or blockage, a narrow passage where movement is restricted. In the middle of the bridge, there was a drawbridge that could be raised to stop invaders. The Mayor of London, William Walworth, had ordered the bridge closed. It should have been impossible to cross, but history turns on human choices, not just stone walls. The rebels marched to the southern gate of the bridge. They did not have to break it down. The drawbridge was lowered. The gates were open. Why? Because the solidarity of the working class was stronger than the orders of the mayor. The ordinary people inside London, the apprentices, the servants, the poor, had lowered the bridge. They welcomed the rebels not as invaders, but as brothers. They saw the army of Essex and Kent as their liberators. The floodgates opened. 30,000 rebels poured across the bridge and into the narrow, twisting streets of London. The city was theirs. Now we see the discipline of the revolt. This is the part that surprises many historians. Usually, when an army enters a city, they loot. They steal gold, wine, and silk. But Wat Tyler had given strict orders. We are seeking truth and justice, not thieves' gold. They marched straight to the Savoy Palace. The Savoy was the most luxurious mansion in England. It belonged to John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the most hated man in the realm. It was filled with tapestries, silver, jewels, and fine art. The rebels smashed the doors. They went inside. But they did not fill their pockets. They took the silver plates and beat them into shapeless lumps with hammers. They took the precious jewels and ground them into dust in large mortars. They took the expensive silk garments and tore them into shreds. They threw everything into the river or into the fire. One man was caught hiding a silver cup in his shirt. The other rebels did not just scold him. They tied him up and threw him into the burning building. They shouted, "We are zealots for truth and justice, not thieves and robbers." By destroying the wealth instead of stealing it, they sent a terrifying message to the aristocracy. They were saying, "We do not want your money. We want to destroy the system that gave you this money." It was a display of moral economy. A moral economy is an economy based on goodness, fairness, and justice, rather than just profit. The peasants believed the rich had violated God's laws by being too greedy. The fires of the Savoy Palace lit up the night sky. The king, watching from the Tower of London, could see his uncle's house burning. The smoke drifted over the river, choking the guards on the battlements. The city was in chaos, but it was organized chaos. The rebels were hunting specific targets. They broke open the Fleet prison and the Marshalsea prison. They burned the records of the lawyers at the temple. Why lawyers? Because lawyers wrote the tax laws. Lawyers wrote the labor statutes. To the peasants, the pen was just as dangerous as the sword. As night fell on June 13th, the rebels camped in the open spaces of the city. They were tired, smelling of smoke and sweat. But they controlled the capital. The king was trapped. His advisors were terrified. They knew that if the rebels broke into the tower, they would all be dead by morning. King Richard II, the boy with the crown, had to make a choice. He could not hide anymore. He had to go out and face the fire. He sent a message to the rebels. "Meet me tomorrow," it said, "at Mile End." Mile End was a large open field just east of the city walls. It was a place where people played sports and held markets. It was about to become the negotiation table for the future of English labor. The king was gambling his life. He was going to ride out, essentially alone, into a sea of 30,000 angry men. But he had a secret weapon: his age. He was a child, and the rebels loved the king. They only hated his evil advisors. Would that distinction save him? The gates of the Tower of London creak open. It is the morning of June 14th, 1381. King Richard II rides out on a white horse. He is flanked by his nervous barons. He is leaving the safest place in England to ride into the middle of a rebel army at Mile End. This is a gamble. If he fails, the monarchy ends today. The crowd at Mile End is vast. Tens of thousands of peasants are waiting. They are not shouting for blood anymore. They are waiting for justice. When they see the boy king, they kneel. They do not hate him. In their minds, he is their protector. It is his evil counselors they want to kill. Richard rides into the center of the field. He looks small against the mass of humanity. He raises his hand. "I am your king and lord," he says. "What will you have?" The rebels present a list of demands that would change the world. First, they demand the abolition of serfdom. They want to be free men, not property. They want to buy and sell goods in the market without paying heavy tolls. They want rent for land to be capped at 4 pence an acre. Basically, they are demanding a free market economy. In 1381, this was a radical, almost alien concept. Richard does not hesitate. He says, "I grant it." He orders his clerks to start writing charters. The clerks set up tables in the field. They write furiously. They stamp the wax seals. They hand out these charters to the peasant leaders. "Here," the king says. "You are free. Now, go home." It seems like a miracle. The peasants are crying with joy. They have won. The king has listened. Many of them pack up their things and start the long walk back to Essex, clutching their charters like winning lottery tickets. But while the king is distracting the main army at Mile End, something dark is happening back at the Tower of London. Remember the impregnable fortress? The Tower of London had never fallen to an enemy. But the king had left the gates open. And the guards? They were paralyzed. A group of rebels, perhaps led by Wat Tyler himself or other captains, marches up to the tower. The legendary guards simply stand aside. Historians still debate why. Were they sympathizers? Were they terrified? Or did they think the king's meeting meant the war was over? The rebels walk right in. They cross the moat. They enter the royal apartments. They are walking into the private bedrooms of the most powerful people in England. They find the king's mother, Joan of Kent, in her bed. She is terrified. They do not hurt her. One rebel even asks for a kiss. She faints. They carry her gently to a boat and send her to safety. But they are not there for her. They are hunting the traitors. They find Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the man who introduced the poll tax. He is praying in the chapel. They grab him. They drag him out of the tower, through the gates, to Tower Hill. A massive crowd gathers. Sudbury is calm. He warns them that killing him will bring an interdict from the Pope. They do not care. The rebels ignore the threat. They force him to kneel. An amateur executioner steps forward with a sword. It is messy. It takes 8 blows to remove his head. They do the same to Robert Hales, the treasurer. They take the heads and put them on spikes. They march them across London Bridge, cheering. When King Richard returns from Mile End, he sees the heads of his closest advisers rotting on the bridge. He realizes the terrible truth. His charters did not stop the violence. The amnesty he promised was ignored. Amnesty is an official pardon for people who have been convicted of political offenses. The hardcore rebels, the ones led by Wat Tyler, are not going home. They have tasted blood. They have seen that the king is weak. They have realized that the impregnable tower was just a building, with scared men inside. Tyler now controls the city. He has the momentum. He has the power. And he is not satisfied with 4 pence an acre. He wants more. The king has played his card, concession. It failed. Now he has no cards left. He retreats to the Royal Wardrobe, a fortified house near St. Paul's Cathedral. He spends the night praying. The next morning, June 15th, will be the final showdown. Tyler demands another meeting. He wants to meet the king at Smithfield. Smithfield was the cattle market of London. It was a place of blood, mud, and commerce. It was fitting. The king agrees. He has no choice. But this time, the atmosphere is different. The euphoria of Mile End is gone. Euphoria is a feeling or state of intense excitement and happiness. It has been replaced by a cold, hard tension. The rebels are suspicious. The king's men are desperate. They are hiding armor under their robes. They are sharpening their daggers. Both sides know that only one group is leaving Smithfield alive. The bargaining power of labor has reached its absolute peak. It is about to crash against the steel of the aristocracy. The air at Smithfield smells of manure and sweat. It is Saturday, June 15th, 1381. The sun is high and hot. Smithfield is a wide, open space just outside the city walls of London. For centuries, it has been a market for horses and cattle. Today, the livestock is gone. Instead, 2 armies are staring at each other across the dust. On one side, the king and his terrified retinue. Retinue is a group of advisors, assistants, or guards accompanying an important person. The king's retinue is small, perhaps only 200 men. They are outnumbered. On the other side, the rebel army. They are confident. They have burned the Savoy. They have beheaded the Archbishop. They believe they are winning. Wat Tyler rides out from the rebel lines. He is alone. He is riding a small horse. He approaches the king. What happens next is a scene of shocking insubordination. Insubordination is the defiance of authority or refusal to obey orders. Tyler does not kneel. He shakes the king's hand roughly. He calls him brother. He asks for a flagon of water. He takes a drink, rinses his mouth, and spits it out on the ground in front of the monarch. This is a calculated insult. In the medieval world, where kings were seen as semi-divine, this was impossible behavior. Tyler is showing his army that the king is just a man. He is flexing his power. Then, Tyler makes his demands. He does not just want lower taxes. He wants a revolution. He demands that all church lands be confiscated and given to the people. He demands that all lordship be abolished. He says, famously, that there should be no law but the law of Winchester, referring to an old police statute, and no bishops save one. Basically, he wants to dismantle the entire feudal system. He wants a communist England, centuries before Karl Marx was born. The king listens quietly. He nods. He says, "All that you ask, I grant." But the tension is unbearable. The king's men are furious. They are watching a peasant humiliate God's anointed ruler. A valet in the king's group shouts out. He points at Tyler and calls him the greatest thief and robber in Kent. Tyler snaps. He pulls out a dagger. He moves toward the valet. This is the flashpoint. Flashpoint is a place, event, or time at which trouble, such as violence or anger, flares up. The Mayor of London, William Walworth, has had enough. Walworth is a rich merchant. He hates the rebels. He sees Tyler draw a weapon in the presence of the king. Walworth rides his horse forward. He shouts, "I arrest you!" Tyler strikes at the mayor, but the mayor is wearing armor under his clothes. The dagger bounces off. Walworth draws his own weapon, a short sword called a basilard. He strikes Tyler in the neck and head. Tyler falls from his horse, bleeding heavily. Another squire rushes in and stabs him again. The leader of the great revolt lies in the dirt. The rebel army, watching from a distance, gasps. They see their captain fall. A cry goes up. "Treason! They have killed our captain!" Thousands of longbows are raised. The strings are drawn back. The arrows are aimed directly at the king and his small group. This is the moment where history usually ends in a massacre. The king's party should have been wiped out in seconds. But then, the 14-year-old king does something counterintuitive. Counterintuitive means contrary to what common sense would suggest. Instead of running away, Richard II spurs his horse forward. He rides toward the arrows. He rides straight at the angry mob. He raises his hand. He is a boy, unarmed, riding into the face of death. He shouts clearly, "Sirs, would you shoot your king? I am your captain. I am your leader. Follow me into the fields, and I will grant you all you ask." The rebels freeze. They are confused. They are used to following a leader. Tyler is dead. The king is offering to take his place. The feudal conditioning kicks in. They have been trained since birth to obey the king. Slowly, the bows are lowered. The anger turns into bewilderment. Richard turns his horse and rides toward the open fields of Clerkenwell, away from the city. The rebels, like a herd of sheep, follow him. They think they are marching to freedom. They think the king is their new general. They are wrong. They are marching into a trap. While Richard leads the rebels away, Mayor Woolworth gallops back into the city. He shouts that the king is in danger. The citizens of London, who had been hiding in fear, finally come out. The rich merchants, the loyal soldiers, the heavy cavalry, they all rally. Within an hour, Woolworth has assembled a massive force. They ride hard for Clerkenwell. The rebels are in the field, surrounding the king. They are expecting charters. They are expecting freedom. Instead, they see the horizon fill with steel. The king's army has arrived. The rebels realize, too late, that they have been outmaneuvered. The bargaining power of labor has just been checkmated by the military strategy of the crown. The king's knights are eager to charge. They want to slaughter the peasants where they stand. They want revenge for the burning of the Savoy and the beheading of the archbishop. Richard raises his hand again. "Stop," he says. He forbids the massacre. He tells the rebels to go home. He tells them to leave their banners and their weapons and just walk away. The rebels look at the army. They look at the dead body of Wat Tyler, which has been dragged from Smithfield. The dream is over. They drop their rusty swords. They drop their sticks. They turn around and begin the long, sad walk back to their villages. They have the king's promises. They have his charters. They believe that, even though they lost the battle, they have won the war for their rights. But promises made at sword point are rarely kept. The summer is about to get very cold. The silence that followed the noise of Smithfield was heavy. The rebels were walking home. They carried the king's charters in their pockets. They believed these pieces of parchment were their tickets to a new life. They thought the bargaining power of their labor had finally been recognized by the crown. They were wrong. They were wrong. While the peasants marched back to their villages in Essex and Kent, King Richard II rode back to the wardrobe in London. He went straight to his mother, Joan of Kent. He went straight to his mother, Joan of Kent. She had been hiding, terrified that her son was dead. When she saw him, she wept. "Ah, fair son," she said, "what pain and anguish have I had for you this day?" Richard looked at her. He was no longer the frightened boy in the tower. He had faced down an army. He had seen a man killed in front of him. He had tasted absolute power. He replied coldly, "Madam, rejoice and praise God. For today I have recovered my heritage that was lost, and the realm of England also." Heritage. This word usually means property or traditions passed down from predecessors. Here, Richard meant his divine right to rule without question. The counter-revolution began immediately. Counter-revolution is a revolution opposing a former one or reversing its results. The first step was to secure the city. Mayor Woolworth, the man who stabbed Wat Tyler, was knighted on the spot. The head of Wat Tyler was cut off his corpse and put on a spike on London Bridge, replacing the head of the archbishop. It was a gruesome exchange. One head for another. Then the king's messengers rode out. They did not carry more charters. They carried a proclamation that revoked everything. Revoke. To put an end to the validity or operation of a decree, decision, or promise. The king declared that all the promises he made at Mile End were null and void. Null and void is a common legal phrase. It means having no legal force. Invalid. Imagine the scene in a village in Essex a few days later. The men are celebrating. They are planning to farm their own land. Then, a royal sheriff arrives with a heavily armed escort. He reads the new decree. Serfs you are, and serfs you will remain. In bondage, not as before, but incomparably worse. The shock must have been physical. The king had lied. But the king did not just lie. He launched a judicial campaign of terror. Judicial relates to the administration of justice or judges. But there was very little justice here. The king appointed a man named Robert Tresilian as the new Chief Justice. Tresilian was a man who enjoyed his work. He traveled to the counties that had rebelled. He set up courts. He did not look for the truth. He looked for names. If you were a leader, you were hanged. If you were a follower who had shouted too loudly, you were hanged. If you had carried a banner, you were hanged. The gallows were busy that summer. Gallows is a structure, typically of 2 uprights and a crosspiece, for the hanging of criminals. Historians estimate that at least 1,500 rebels were executed in the weeks following the revolt. It was a purge. A purge is an abrupt or violent removal of a group of people from an organization or place. But here is the twist. The king wanted to go further. He wanted to crush the peasantry so completely that they would never rise again. He called a meeting of Parliament in November 1381. He asked the landowners and merchants a question. He asked, "Do you want to free the serfs? If you want to, I am willing to do it." This seems strange. Why would he ask that? He was testing them. He wanted to share the blame. If the serfs remained in bondage, he wanted the Parliament to say it, not just him. The Parliament, composed entirely of rich landowners, reacted with horror. They said, essentially, "God forbid. We would rather die all together in one day than lose our services." They refused to give up their free labor. They passed new laws to tighten the chains. They tried to fix wages even lower. They tried to stop peasants from moving to the cities. It seemed like the revolt had been a total failure. The leaders were dead. The charters were burned. The chains were back on. But history is not a straight line. It is a pendulum. The demographic reality had not changed. The Black Death had still happened. There were still too few workers. You can hang 1,500 men, but you cannot print more people. The lords found that, despite their tough laws, they still couldn't find anyone to harvest the wheat. They still couldn't find anyone to shear the sheep. So, what did they do? They cheated. They ignored their own laws. To get workers, they had to pay them higher wages secretly. They had to offer them better terms. They had to treat them with a little more respect. If a lord was too cruel, his serfs would simply run away to the next manor, or to the city of London, where city air makes you free. City air makes you free was a medieval legal principle. If a serf could live in a city for a year and a day without being caught, he became a free man. So, while the statute of laborers was still on the books, the market forces were stronger. Market forces are the economic factors affecting the price of, demand for, and availability of a commodity. In this case, the commodity was human labor. The Revolt of 1381 did not legally end serfdom, but it was the death knell of the system. A death knell is the tolling of a bell to mark someone's death. Metaphorically, it refers to an event that signals the end of something. Within 100 years, serfdom in England had quietly vanished. Not because of a law, but because it simply didn't make economic sense anymore. The bargaining power of labor, once awakened, could not be put back to sleep. But there is one final, tragic chapter to the story of 1381. We must look at what happened to the boy king, Richard II. The revolt was the defining moment of his life. It taught him that he could control the masses with a word. It taught him that he was special. It made him arrogant. It made him believe he was untouchable. And that belief would eventually cost him his crown and his life. The ghost of Wat Tyler did not disappear. It waited in the shadows of the throne. The bodies on the gallows eventually rotted away, but the problem that caused the revolt did not. In the years following 1381, a strange silence settled over England. It was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a standoff. A standoff is a deadlock between two equally matched opponents in a dispute or conflict. The king and the nobles had the swords, but the peasants still had the labor. And in the end, you cannot eat swords. Let us return to the economics of the farm. Imagine a lord in 1385, 4 years after the revolt. His wheat is ripe. The sky is turning gray. Rain is coming. If he does not harvest the crop in 3 days, he loses his income for the year. He calls a local laborer. He offers him the wage set by the statute of laborers, 2 pence a day. The laborer looks at the sky. He looks at the wheat. He knows the Lord is desperate. He says, politely but firmly, "I cannot live on 2 pence. My neighbor offers 4. The Lord has a choice. He can report the man to the newly tough justices. He can have him punished. But if he does that, the wheat rots. The Lord will go bankrupt. So the Lord grinds his teeth. He looks around to make sure no one is watching. And he pays the 4 pence. This secret transaction happened thousands of times across England. It was a conspiracy of mutual necessity. Conspiracy. A secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful. Here, the conspiracy was between the rich and the poor to ignore the king's laws. This era, specifically the late 14th and 15th centuries, is often called the Golden Age of the English peasantry. Why golden? Because of real wages. For English learners, this is a vital economic distinction. Nominal wages are the actual amount of money you get paid, for example, 4 pence. Real wages are what that money can actually buy, for example, how much bread or meat. After the revolt, prices for food actually dropped because the population was smaller, fewer mouths to eat the grain. But wages stayed high or rose, fewer hands to grow the grain. High wages plus low prices equals high purchasing power. Purchasing power is the financial ability to buy products and services. Suddenly, the English peasant could afford more than just survival. They began to eat meat every day, not just on feast days. They drank better ale. They bought better cloth. Archaeologists digging up villages from this time find evidence of this wealth. They find brass buckles, pewter spoons, and better pottery. These were luxuries that their grandfathers could never have dreamed of. The standard of living skyrocketed. Standard of living refers to the level of wealth, comfort, material goods, and health available to a certain socio-economic class. The irony is deep. The government crushed the revolt to keep the peasants poor, but the invisible hand of the labor market made them richer anyway. The invisible hand is a metaphor introduced later by economist Adam Smith, but it applies perfectly here. It describes the unseen forces that move the free market economy. The revolt of 1381 had terrified the landowners. They realized that if they pushed the peasants too hard, another Wat Tyler might rise up. So they became cautious. They stopped trying to enforce the old feudal dues. Slowly, serfdom withered away. Wither means to become dry and shriveled, to cease to flourish. Lords began to rent out their land to peasants instead of forcing them to work it. The serf became a tenant farmer. He paid cash rent. If he made a profit, he kept it. He was, for all intents and purposes, a free man. By 1500, serfdom was effectively dead in England. It wasn't abolished by a single Emancipation Proclamation. It was killed by the bargaining power of labor. But while the peasants were quietly winning the economic war, the king was losing his political mind. Richard II never forgot Smithfield. He never forgot how he, a 14-year-old boy, had commanded the mob when his advisors had failed. He grew up believing he was a strategic genius. He believed he had a special connection to God. He began to act like a tyrant. He ignored Parliament. He arrested his enemies without trial. He seized land. He built a private army. He forgot the lesson of 1381. Power depends on the consent of the people, or at least the consent of the powerful. He started to alienate the very nobles who had saved him. Alienate. To cause someone to feel isolated or estranged. One of the nobles he alienated was his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Henry was the son of John of Gaunt, the man whose palace was burned. Henry was powerful, rich, and popular. Richard, in a fit of paranoia, exiled Henry from England. He threw him out of the country and stole his inheritance. This was a fatal mistake. In 1399, 18 years after the Peasants' Revolt, Henry Bolingbroke returned. He did not come alone. He came with an army. And here is the echo of history. When Henry landed in England, the people flocked to him. The peasants, who remembered Richard's broken promises. The merchants, who hated Richard's erratic taxes. The nobles, who feared Richard's tyranny. Richard II found himself in the same position he had been in during the revolt, trapped, with no friends, watching an army approach. But this time, there was no Smithfield. There was no Wat Tyler to kill. There was no magic trick to save him. The king who had crushed the peasants was about to be crushed by his own cousin. The cycle of violence was closing. Cycle. A series of events that are regularly repeated in the same order. Richard was captured. He was forced to abdicate, give up the crown. He was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and there, in the cold dark, the boy who had faced down 30,000 angry men met a lonely end. The king is dead. Long live the king. It is February 1400. In the freezing dungeon of Pontefract Castle, Richard II takes his last breath. History is unsure exactly how he died. Some say he was murdered by starvation, denied food until his body shut down. Others say he simply lost the will to live. But the irony is sharp enough to cut glass. The king who tried to starve the peasants of their rights was, in the end, starved of his own life. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, was now King Henry IV. But Henry had a problem. He was a usurper. Usurper. This is a powerful noun. It refers to a person who takes a position of power or importance illegally or by force. Because Henry had taken the throne by force, he was weak. He needed support. He needed money to pay his armies, and to get money, he had to ask Parliament. This is the law of unintended consequences. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 had terrified the ruling class. But the fall of Richard II in 1399 terrified the monarchs. It proved that a king could be removed. It proved that the divine right of kings, the idea that God appoints the ruler, was not a shield against steel. So Henry IV had to listen. He had to bargain. The House of Commons in Parliament began to gain real power. The House of Commons. This is the lower house of the Parliament of England, and now the UK. It represents the common people, not the lords. In 1381, the peasants had demanded a voice. They were slaughtered for it. But 20 years later, the institution that represented the commons, even if it was mostly rich merchants and gentry, was dictating terms to the king. The door had been kicked open. It would never fully close again. Now, let us look at the legacy of the revolt on the ground. Legacy. An amount of money or property left to someone in a will. But metaphorically, it means the long-lasting impact of an event. The legacy of 1381 was the death of feudalism and the birth of capitalism. This is a big claim. Let's break it down. Feudalism was based on status. You were born a lord, or you were born a serf. Your position was fixed by blood. You exchanged labor for protection. There was no money involved in the core transaction. Capitalism is based on contract. You agree to work for a certain amount of time for a certain amount of money. You are free to leave. You are free to negotiate. After 1381, the English economy shifted from status to contract. The lords realized that owning a serf was expensive. You had to feed him when he was old. You had to house him. And if he rebelled, he might burn your house down. Hiring a free laborer was safer. You paid him a wage. If the harvest was bad, you stopped paying him. You had no responsibility for his soul. So, the lords began to manumit their serfs. Manumit. This is a formal verb. It means to release from slavery, to set free. They gave them their freedom not out of kindness, but out of calculation. It was an economic decision. The bargaining power of the laborer had made serfdom inefficient. By the year 1450, most English villages looked very different from the villages of 1380. The strip farming system, where everyone worked thin strips of land in a big open field, was disappearing. Farmers were enclosing their land. They were putting up hedges and fences. They were farming sheep for wool, because the price of English wool was skyrocketing in Europe. This created a new class of people, the yeoman. A yeoman, pronounced yeoman, is a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate, a freeholder. The yeoman was not a lord, but he was not a serf. He was independent. He had a longbow hanging over his fireplace. He had money in his purse. He was the ancestor of the modern middle class. It was this class of men, the sons and grandsons of the rebels, who would build the future of England. They would become the archers who won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. They would become the merchants who sailed to the New World. But what about the memory of 1381? Did people talk about Wat Tyler? Did they sing songs about John Ball? Publicly, no. It was dangerous. The government had cracked down on seditious speech. Seditious. Adjective. Inciting or causing people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch. But privately, in the alehouses, in the fields, the memory stayed alive. The rhyme of John Ball, "When Adam delved and Eve span," became a kind of secret code. It was a reminder that equality was the natural state of humanity. It became a specter. A specter is a ghost, but in political language, it refers to a widely feared possible occurrence. Every time a lord thought about raising rents too high, he remembered the heads on London Bridge. Every time a parliament discussed a new poll tax, they whispered, "Remember 1381. The revolt had created a psychological ceiling on oppression. The rich knew there was a line they could not cross. If they pushed the poor too far, the poor would not just starve, they would burn the palace. This balance of terror kept English society relatively stable for the next century. It forced the elite to share the wealth, however grudgingly. But ideas are like viruses. They mutate, they sleep, and then, when the conditions are right, they wake up again. The ideas of 1381, that all men are free, that government requires consent, did not die with Wat Tyler. They went underground. They traveled into the religious movements of the Lollards. They traveled into the printing presses of the 16th century. They traveled into the minds of men who would one day chop off the head of another king, Charles I, in the English Civil War. The Peasants' Revolt was a precursor. A precursor is a person or thing that comes before another of the same kind, a forerunner. It was the dress rehearsal for the modern world. But before we conclude, we must ask a difficult question. The peasants won their economic freedom, yes. But did they win political power? Did the common man actually get a vote? No. That would take another 500 years. The bargaining power of labor could change wages, but it could not easily change the Constitution. The struggle shifted from the field to the factory, from the pitchfork to the picket line. In the next part, we will trace this line directly to the present day. We will see how the language of the 1381 revolt, the language of rights and liberties, became the foundation of the English we speak today. We will look at the vocabulary of protest. History does not just leave behind bones and ruins. It leaves behind words. The men and women who marched on London in 1381 did not just carry weapons. They carried a new vocabulary. They were the first large group of ordinary English people to speak the language of protest. Before 1381, if you were a peasant, you didn't negotiate. You obeyed. If you were unhappy, you didn't strike. You suffered. But Wat Tyler, John Ball, and the thousands behind them changed the dictionary of power. Today, we use their words every time we turn on the news or sign an employment contract. Let's look at 4 key terms they gave us or redefined for us. The first word is grievance. In modern English, a grievance is a real or imagined wrong or other cause for complaint, especially unfair treatment. If you have a problem at work today, perhaps your boss is bullying you or your pay is wrong, you file a formal grievance. In 1381, the peasants had a list of grievances. They did not just burn things randomly, they wrote down exactly what was wrong. The poll tax was too high. The corruption was too deep. The serfdom was too cruel. They formalized their anger. They turned emotion into a document. The second word is commonwealth. This is a beautiful compound noun. Common plus wealth. Today, we use it to describe a political community founded for the common good. But in the 14th century, wealth meant well-being, not just money. John Ball preached that the common weal, the well-being of the ordinary people, was more important than the luxury of the king. He argued that the state exists to serve the many, not the few. This was a radical inversion of medieval thought. Inversion. The action of inverting something, or the state of being inverted. A reversal of position, order, or relationship. The third word is riot versus revolt. This is a lesson in perspective. Perspective. A particular attitude toward or way of regarding something, a point of view. The king's chroniclers called the events of 1381 a riot. A riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. It implies chaos, crime, and lack of reason. But the peasants called it a revolt or a rising. A revolt is an attempt to put an end to the authority of a person or body by rebelling. It implies a cause, a strategy, and a goal. When you read history, check the vocabulary. If the writer uses mob, they are usually on the side of authority. If they use protesters, they are usually on the side of the people. The fourth word is liberty. We hear this word constantly in American and British politics. But in 1381, liberty was not an abstract concept. It was physical. It meant the right to move. Remember, a serf was bound to the soil. He could not leave his village without permission. The rebels demanded liberty of movement. They wanted to sell their labor to the highest bidder. This is the birth of the free market for labor. Free market. An economic system in which prices are determined by unrestricted competition between privately owned businesses. The rebels were, in a strange way, the first capitalists. They wanted to sell their work. The lords were the ones trying to fix the prices. These ideas did not die when Wat Tyler fell at Smithfield. They went to sleep in the soil of England. They hibernated. 200 years later, in the 1640s, England exploded again in the Civil War. A group called the Levellers appeared. They wore sea-green ribbons. They demanded equality. They quoted the Bible. And who did they quote? They quoted John Ball. When Adam delved and Eve span. The echo of 1381 was loud and clear. Then, jump forward to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. The fields were replaced by factories. The manor became the mill. The lord became the boss. The conditions were terrible. Children worked 14 hours a day. The air was black with coal smoke. So, the workers organized again. They formed unions. A union is an organized association of workers formed to protect and further their rights and interests. They used the strike. To strike is to refuse to work as a form of organized protest. But unlike the peasants of 1381, the unions of the 19th century had better luck. They had the vote, eventually. They had the press. They had the legal framework. Framework. An essential supporting structure of a building, vehicle, or object. Here, it means the laws that support society. They abolished child labor. They won the weekend. They secured the minimum wage. But every time a union leader stands up and demands fair pay for a fair day's work, they are channeling the spirit of the Essex men in the woods. The bargaining power of labor is not a static thing. It flows like a tide. Sometimes, like after the Black Death, the tide is high. Labor is scarce, and workers are powerful. Sometimes the tide is low. There are too many workers, or machines replace them, and wages fall. We are living through a similar moment today. We have automation and AI threatening to replace human labor. We have a gig economy where workers have no contracts. Gig economy. A labor market characterized by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance work, as opposed to permanent jobs. Are we returning to a time of insecurity? Are we moving back to a world where the worker has no bargaining power? The history of 1381 teaches us that when the gap between the rich and the poor becomes too wide, and when the social contract is broken, the result is instability. Social contract. An implicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits. The peasants of 1381 believed the king had broken the contract. They believed the rich had broken the contract, so they tore up the rulebook. As we approach the end of our journey, we must weigh the final cost. Was it worth it? Was the death of 1,500 rebels a wasted sacrifice? Or was it the necessary blood that watered the tree of English liberty? In the final part, we will render a verdict. We will look at the ultimate lesson of the Peasants' Revolt for you, the English learner and history lover. We will answer the question, who really won? Stand with me one last time in Smithfield, London. Today, it is a quiet place. There is a small park. There are cafes. The screams of 1381 are gone. The blood has been washed away by 600 years of rain. But if you listen closely to the history, you can still hear the echo. So, who won? On paper, the king won. Richard II survived. The rebels were executed. The laws remained on the books. The status quo was restored. Status quo. A Latin phrase used in English meaning the existing state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. But history is not decided on paper. It is decided in reality. The Peasants' Revolt was a strategic defeat, but a long-term victory. The king and the nobles learned a terrifying lesson. The English people were not sheep. They were a sleeping lion. If you poked the lion too hard, it would wake up and bite your head off. This created a check and balance. A check and balance is a system that allows each branch of a government to amend or veto acts of another branch so as to prevent any one branch from exerting too much power. Here, the check was the threat of violence. The elites stopped pushing so hard. They stopped trying to force wages down to starvation levels. They realized that a slightly richer peasant was better than a dead lord. Labor had proven its power. The bargaining power of the worker had moved from a theoretical concept to a physical reality. And what about the English language? The revolt changed how we speak about power. Before 1381, the language of government was French or Latin. The language of the people was English. When the rebels demanded their rights, they demanded them in English. They forced the king to speak to them in English. They proved that English was a language of politics, of philosophy, and of resistance. They gave us the words we use to fight for fairness today. Fairness, freedom, common profit. These are not just words. They are tools. For you, the English learner, this story is a gold mine. A gold mine is a place where gold is mined, but metaphorically, it is a source of wealth or valuable information. You have learned vocabulary about economics, inflation, wages, scarcity. You have learned vocabulary about conflict, insurrection, suppression, amnesty. You have learned vocabulary about society, hierarchy, class, solidarity. But more importantly, you have learned how to tell a story of cause and effect. Cause and effect. The principle of causation, how one event leads to another. The Black Death, cause, led to a labor shortage, effect. The labor shortage, cause, led to higher wages, effect. The government crackdown, cause, led to the revolt, effect. This is the grammar of history. As we close this chronicle, remember Wat Tyler not just as a violent man with a rusty sword, but as a symbol that even the poorest person has a limit. Remember the boy king, Richard II, not just as a tyrant, but as a warning that power without consent is fragile. And remember the bargaining power of labor. It is the invisible force that built the middle class. It is the reason you have a weekend. It is the reason you can negotiate your salary. It started in the silence of the plague graves. It exploded in the fire of London. And it lives on in the freedom we enjoy today. Thank you for listening to the London Gritty Chronicles. Keep learning, keep questioning, and never forget the history beneath your feet.